highlights this idea that teachers indeed are also motivated by having sanitation facilities.
That seems like a very reasonable ask. So how would this inform how we think about school facilities and infrastructure in kind of all countries, developing and developed?
Yeah, absolutely. So, while this is promising, it's really important that we go beyond thinking about construction only without thinking about maintenance and usage. So when these countries often fund these construction efforts, they don't actually put money in for maintenance. So, if we make these capital investments without putting in funds to actually maintain and keep up with repairs, then, in a couple of years, it's suddenly going to go away. And especially with something like sanitation, you really need to keep it up. And in some places, so UNICEF was the implementing partner, and their recommendation was, it should be the children who do it. Now, how it actually played out really varied by location. So sometimes teachers were asked to do it on top of their many other responsibilities, and teachers in these schools are asked to do everything. Often they're the ones who have to clean. They've got to create cook the midday meals. They've got to, whitewash the walls. Sometimes they're in charge of elections. So they have a ton of responsibilities. And so if it was put on them, then sometimes you would actually see the latrines get locked up or used as a cowshed, or, they would deteriorate due to disuse or misuse. Sometimes it was used as a punishment to clean them for kids. Sometimes it was given to those considered to be part of castes lower on the social hierarchy. So, I think we really need to think systematically about maintenance, and it wouldn't cost that much just to hire somebody who can do it properly. Now, separately, usage is a real thing. So, a lot of times these are our pit latrines, which is like a hole in the ground. But the design is not necessarily child-centered. So sometimes they would make the holes adult size or too big. And so kids were falling in, or like snakes would come out. And, it's like this smelly box that you're put in without ventilation. And there wasn't training as to how to use it. And, so it's not just if you build it, they will come. We need to be much more thoughtful about what will make people actually use these.
Yeah, it reminds me of, in the U.S., I know after World War II in the 40s and 50s, there was a big boom in school construction. A lot more, students in cities, all these schools getting built, and a lot of them kind of the cities let those schools just kind of ride out for 60, 70 years, and now here we are. And
that's right.
Big wave of schools that need a lot of, maintenance or even new school buildings, and the cities put it off so long that now it's this big cost, and no one knows what to do with.
And we haven't actually kept up with, the way that a school or a classroom looks today is the same as it looked 100 years ago. And so, we're not constantly innovating and saying, how do children really learn best, and incorporating that into our classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you found that infrastructure investments, even beyond schools themselves, can have a positive impact on education. Specifically, your 2020 paper on the impact of Indian road construction on educational investments. What did you find in this study?
Yeah, so in that paper, we examined educational responses to a national Indian road construction program that connected over 100,000 previously unconnected villages to the larger regional areas via a paved road. The idea is that roads should help to equalize regional factor prices through reduced transport costs. So when we say factor prices, we're talking about wages or returns to education. So in equilibrium, urban areas have higher wages, both credentialed and uncredentialed, and higher returns to education than rural areas. So if you connect a village to its external market, then what, in theory should happen is that the local village wage, both the credentialed and the uncredentialed wage, should go up, and the returns to education should go up. And so the way that we think about it is when that uncredentialed wage rises, then we think of it as an opportunity cost effect. Because when I say an uncredentialed wage, that means that you don't need, some sort of schooling degree for particular jobs. And then you would expect schooling to decrease because I have no incentive to stay in school at a younger age because I can just get a job and get paid money without having to go to school. But if that skill premium or credential premium rises, then we call that a returns to education effect. And so you'd expect to see schooling to increase because there's a reason to stay in school. And each of these effects should be largest when that regional wage or regional return to education is much larger than that local village or the local wage or return to education. And what we see is that on average, after roads were constructed, we do see increases in adolescent schooling, increases in middle school exam performance, and the treatment heterogeneity that we see is consistent with what you could think of as a standard human capital model. So, there are positive effects in places when that opportunity cost effect is low, or the gap is low. So if the uncredentialed wage is very similar in the regional area to the village, then that means that there's no real difference. And so you shouldn't see changes in schooling. But when the return to education is much higher in this regional area, you also see increases in schooling. And so, and it doesn't seem to be driven by migration or other government programs or access to school.
Mm-hmm. Have we found other kind of infrastructure projects that have had this second degree positive impact on education?
So basically there are, schooling itself. So, what the theory is, right? Schooling may respond to labor demand shocks and domestic market integration in different ways. So you'd expect it to increase if there are increased returns to education, if there are increases to household income or decreases to liquidity constraints, and you'd expect them to decrease if there's increased opportunity cost of schooling. And that's borne out in the literature. So when you see construction or entry of call center jobs, for example, so now people need to know English or they need to know, particular languages. So you see more people investing in education. But, the opposite case is in Mexico when they brought in these export manufacturing factories. You actually saw people sorting out of school because now the opportunity costs were higher.
So you're an enthusiastic researcher who I'm sure is always into looking into new interesting things. Is there any new interesting research you're working on right now?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I'm really interested in how much further we can get if we address basic needs. And so my prior work was primarily thinking about issues related to safety and health and economic security. But I also think of two other fundamental needs that we don't talk enough about. One is the notion of justice, and one is the notion of representation. With justice, it's if I don't feel like I belong or that I'm treated fairly or as a whole human being, then how can I participate as a whole human being? Mm-hmm. And separately, if I don't see myself in the world or if I don't see others, then again, you are not a whole human being in the world around you. And so with justice, this is related to just trying to understand how do we learn how to behave? None of us really know how to act, right? We're all kind of making it up as we go along. We learn from our parents, and we think, especially as when we're children, that, they know what they're doing, but they don't know what they're doing. They're making it up as they went along, and they're learning from their parents. We learn from our peers, but it's the same problem. But as a society, we do look at schools, and there's almost this assumption that the way schools conduct their business is correct. It's sanctioned behavior, that they know what they're doing. And, school officials also are human, and they're also making it up. They're often basing it off of personal sentiment or, what popular opinion might be. Sometimes it's based off of the research, but, especially when we think about how to engage with behavior, how do we decide how to proceed? So for a school official, there are two main considerations that they, need to take into account when they engage with students. One is the nature of the engagement, and one is the timing of the engagement. So the nature is, okay, do I act in response or, subsequent to any behavior that happens? So am I reactive? Or am I more proactive, where I try to shape your behavior before it happens? Separately, the timing is, that's the timing. The nature is, am I more punitive? So is it about punishment or retribution? Or am I more restorative or positive? And, school officials try different combinations of these, but it's not that one school official cares more about children on average who does, who's more reactive or punitive than another school official who decides to be more restorative. And so, stepping back, we're trying to say, well, what happens when, for example, a school district goes from being much more punitive, so using suspensions, being more likely to expel students to a more restorative type of model. And when I say restorative, the idea is like, okay, let's restore our relationship or transform our relationship, because often you didn't even have a relationship to begin with, or repair the harm. So, if I drew on your walls or hit you or even killed your mother. So this is actually something that comes from the criminal justice world. What happens instead of just locking me up or suspending me? What happens if we actually talk to each other and I actually hear about the harms that I caused? Because, when you suspend a student or, put someone in some sort of juvenile detention center, what are they actually learning? Like, what is our goal? Is the goal to have the quote unquote perpetrator learn new behavior? Is it for the victim, if we want to be very simplistic about this, to feel whole again? Is it for bystanders to have a deterrent? In some ways, most of the time, a suspension or, a jail sentence doesn't actually do any of these. And so going towards more restorative practices is trying to address these. So that's one set of projects, is trying to understand that. Separately with representation, what we're actually trying to do is first saying, the process of education and its associated books and materials necessarily and by design transmit the beliefs of society, and whose space it is. And the presence and absence of different identities send messages which can contribute to how we view our own potential and the potential of others, which can then shape subconscious defaults. And so we say that representation matters, but do we even know if it's changed? Do we know how to measure it systematically? And, when I say representation, there's two different kinds of representation. There's a numerical accounting of, let me count the number of identities that are present. But, if people are shown in a reductive or a stereotypical manner, then in some ways it doesn't matter if they're shown a lot, because, and actually it can be counterproductive. It also matters how people are being portrayed. And so what we're trying to do, traditionally, the way that people have been analyzing content for a long time in really amazing ways is they literally go page by page, painstakingly coding everything, in these books, which allow you to measure not just the whether people are being represented, but how people are being represented. And so what we're wanting to do is, can we leverage separately, all these new advances in artificial intelligence, so computer vision, natural language processing, to try to systematically get this information and these messages from books. And, one thing about AI is that it's much easier to measure in some ways whether, but it's harder to measure how, but there are tools out there. And it's also important to remember that AI is only human. It necessarily reflects the biases of the humans who actually train the models, code the data, but that's the same thing with traditional content analysis. And so if we can use these tools, as complements and in concert with each other, then we might actually be able to get into the black box of what children are actually being exposed to. And so we've been applying them to award-winning children's books in the U.S. So like Newbery books, Newbery Award winners and Caldecott Award winners, which, children are 4 times as likely to check out from libraries. They're much more likely to purchase. They don't go out of print, so they're more likely to also show up in your school classroom or your library. And we can already see big differences in terms of the representation across these different kinds of books where, the Newbery and Caldecotts, which we consider mainstream books, because they're selected for their quote unquote high literary value, as opposed to a different set of books which are given awards because they center specific underrepresented identities. We see that these Newbery and Caldecott books are more likely to depict characters with lighter skin than characters in the diversity collection. But all of the collections, for example, are more likely to show depict characters who are classified as children with lighter skin than characters who are classified as adults. And so this to me was actually shocking, for example, that there's no biological or systemic reason why we should see children with lighter skin, especially going back to the 1920s, And, the reason this really concerns me is because we live in a society where